Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. This woeful death will change Forrester Creations ever is designed to serve not simply as a shocking plot twist within the bold and the beautiful, but as a seismic narrative rupture that redefines the emotional, moral, and institutional core of Forrester Creations, using the language of irrevocable loss to signal that nothing, neither power structures, family alliances, creative identity, nor heritage, will ever completely recover from what has been broken, because in the world of this story, death is no way just the end of a life but the violent interruption of fortune, ambition, love, and generational durability, and the script's repeated emphasis on words like woeful, ever, no way be the same, and changes everything isn't embroidery but a deliberate architecture device that prepares the followership for a metamorphosis that operates on multiple situations at formerly emotional desolation for the characters who must live with the absence. Institutional chaos for a company erected on visionaries and icons, and thematic elaboration for a cleaner pieces that thrives on heritage but infrequently confronts its absolute fragility. From the opening recrimination that a life has been lost, the script incontinently situates the death as emblematic rather than incidental, making it clear that this isn't a passing shock designed to induce a brief shaft in drama, but a foundational event that fractures Forrester Creations at its roots, because the existent who dies isn't only emotionally central but structurally essential, someone whose presence held together battles, intentions, commitment, and creative direction, and with that presence gone, every undetermined conflict becomes sharper. Every buried resentment resurfaces, and every moral concession suddenly feels heavier, as if the characters are now forced to live in the shadow of a question they can no way answer: what would have happened if this person had lived. The script's tone leans into ineluctability, suggesting that the tragedy feels both unforeseen and cruelly preordained, as though the Forrester macrocosm itself has been inching toward this moment, layering times of emotional debt that can only be paid through unrecoverable loss. And by framing the death as commodity that shocks BNB, the narrative acknowledges the followership's long-term relationship with these characters, inviting observers to witness not only surprise but grief, treason, and empirical apprehension, because when a death is important enough to shock an entire cleaner pieces world, it implies that indeed the implied rules of survival and return have been violated. The expression "a life lost, a heritage broken" is particularly pivotal, because it signals that the consequences extend far beyond mourning, reaching into the veritably identity of Forrester Creations as a fashion house erected on heritage, and the myth of durability, and in this environment, the death functions as an emblematic ramifying of the line between history and future, calling into question whether the company can still claim authenticity, moral authority, or creative integrity without the guiding force that formerly defined it. And this pressure becomes rich ground for power struggles, as surviving characters scramble to reinterpret the heritage left before, each shaping the memory of the departed to suit their own requirements, intentions, and precariousness. The script implicitly understands that grief in a commercial family like the Forresters is no way pure, because grief competes with occasion, and mourning exists alongside computation, meaning that boardroom opinions, creative appropriations, and romantic realignments all carry the uncomfortable weight of serving from someone differently's absence, a moral nebulosity that deepens the tragedy and prevents the story from resolving into simple sadness. Throughout the narrative inferred by this script, death becomes a glass that forces every character to defy who they really are when the stabilizing presence is gone, exposing which connections were genuine and which were transactional, which commitment were embedded in love and which in fear or convenience. And as Forrester Creations rolls, the company itself begins to serve as a character in extremity, its halls echoing with absence, its fashion shows pigmented with melancholy, its designs unconsciously reflecting loss through darker palettes, sharper outlines, or nostalgic calls that betray an incapability to move forward, and this aesthetic shift reinforces the idea that the death has infected not just hearts but creativity itself. The script's asseveration that Forrester Creations will no way be the same is particularly reverberative in a kidney where change is frequently temporary and reversals are common, because it challenges the cleaner pieces tradition of equilibrium, suggesting that some injuries do'nt heal fairly and some ages do'nt return, and by doing so, it elevates the death into a thematic statement about time, mortality, and the limits of control, reminding observers that indeed in a world defined by glamour and power, there are forces that cannot be negotiated with, enticed, or overreached. The tragedy also acts as a catalyst for generational conflict, as youngish characters are suddenly thrust into places they aren't emotionally or innocently prepared for, forced to inherit not only power but undetermined trauma, while aged characters are brazened with the intimidating consummation that their influence was more dependent on a single person than they ever admitted, creating a destabilizing vacuum where authority becomes contested and the future of the company feels frighteningly uncertain. Romantically, the death recontextualizes love stories by transubstantiating them into stories of remorse, untreated business, and hanging what-ifs, because in cleaner pieces sense, death freezes connections at their most undetermined point, denying check and turning memory into both comfort and torture, and the script seems poised to exploit this by allowing the departed to remain emotionally present through flashbacks, exchanges, and emblematic gestures, icing that the loss continues to shape opinions long after the burial ends. Innocently, the tragedy introduces a reckoning, as secrets connected to the departed hang to surface, and conduct formerly justified by fidelity or protection are redefined under the harsh light of unrecoverable consequence, forcing characters to ask whether their choices contributed to the loss and whether redemption is possible when remission can no longer be sought from the person who signified most. Structurally, the script uses the death as a narrative reset button that doesn't abolish the history but rather magnifies it, pulling long-running stories into a single gravitational center of grief and consequence, thereby streamlining the drama while enhancing its emotional stakes. And this effectiveness is part of what makes the event feel monumental rather than sensational, because it reorganizes the narrative macrocosm around absence rather than presence. The followership, meanwhile, is deposited as both substantiation and mourner, invited to suffer not only the character but the period they represented. And this meta-subcast of liar deepens engagement by admitting that observers themselves have invested times in the measures, connections, and rituals that are now being disintegrated, making the death feel particular rather than abstract. Eventually, the script's power lies in its understanding that tragedy in a cleaner pieces must do further than shock, it must transfigure, and by framing the death as commodity that changes everything, it commits to exploring the long-term fallout rather than rushing toward resolution, allowing pain, confusion, ambition, and nostalgia to attend in messy, uncomfortable ways that reflect real mortal responses to loss, indeed within a heightened, glamorous world, and in doing so, it reaffirms why the bold and the beautiful remains compelling after decades on the air because it recognizes that the most continuing drama doesn't come from endless reiteration, but from moments when the story dares to break its own heart, immolation certainty, and let death mean commodity endless, leaving Forrester Creations, and everyone connected to it, ever marked by what has been lost and by who they're forced to come in its absence. Reshaping every corner of Forrester Creations in ways that are quieter than the original desolation yet far more continuing, because once the raw shock fades, what remains is the long, grinding work of living in a world permanently altered. And it's then that the script deepens its thematic ambition by refusing to let grief be a singular event and rather portraying it as an evolving condition that infiltrates ambition, love, creativity, and identity, turning everyday opinions into moral tests visited by absence. Boardroom meetings come laden with implied comparisons to the departed, every offer quietly measured against what they would have wanted, creating a terrain where invention feels contemporaneously critical and interdicted, as if moving forward too bravely risks betraying the heritage while standing still risks suffocating the company altogether. And this pressure energizes subtle power struggles that are more dangerous than open warfare because they're cloaked in reverence and grief, allowing characters to justify ruthless pushes as acts of preservation. The script precisely illustrates how memory itself becomes a queried resource, with different coalitions within the Forrester family shaping contending narratives of who the departed truly was: visionary, dictator, moral compass, defective genius, each interpretation serving as an armament in the battle for creative and commercial control. And this fragmentation of heritage underscores a painful verity: death doesn't unify people for long, but rather exposes the fault lines that were always present, now stripped of the one force able of holding them together. Creatively, Forrester Creations enters an identity extremity, as contrivers struggle to articulate a vision that feels authentic without counting on reproduction, and fashion shows take on the quality of monuments, with critics and interposers likewise questioning whether the house is recognizing the history or caching behind it, a dilemma that glasses the emotional palsy of characters who cannot decide whether remembering is an act of love or an reason to avoid threat. The script uses these creative debates as conceits for grief itself, suggesting that mourning frequently masquerades as fidelity while still eroding growth, and that true respect for a heritage may bear the courage to evolve beyond it, an assignment that characters repel because elaboration feels like erasure when the loss is still fresh. Interpersonally, connections formerly defined by balance and collective understanding begin to cock under the weight of undetermined feelings, as guilt, remorse, and resentment face in unanticipated ways, transubstantiating abettors into adversaries and exposing romantic bonds to strains they were no way designed to endure. Because love in this fate is no longer just about desire or commitment but about survival, about chancing someone who can bear substantiation to grief without being consumed by it. The absence left by the death becomes a silent third presence in every intimate discussion, shaping what's said and, more importantly, what remains inenerable, as characters avoid defying trueness that might interlace them in the tragedy, whether through neglect, contest, or choices that laterally set events in stir. And this moral nebulosity deepens the drama by refusing to assign blame fairly, rather portraying loss as the accretive result of mortal frailty rather than a single unlawful act. Generationally, the fallout accelerates the passage of power, forcing youngish characters into leadership places that expose their precariousness and intentions with brutal clarity, as they grapple with pretender pattern, fear of failure, and the insolvable task of recognizing a legend while forging their own identity, and the script allows these struggles to unfold sluggishly, emphasizing mistakes and moments of mistrustfulness rather than immediate triumph, thereby buttressing the idea that heritage is inherited seamlessly but earned through painful trial. Aged characters, meanwhile, defy their own mortality and fustiness, fating that the death has stripped down visions of permanence and control, leaving them vulnerable in a world that no longer revolves around familiar scales. And this empirical reckoning adds a subcast of quiet melancholy to their conduct, as opinions are pigmented with the knowledge that time is no longer an abstract conception but an adversary that has formerly claimed someone irreplaceable. Structurally, the narrative resists check by allowing the death to remain an open crack rather than a resolved chapter, weaving its consequences into multiple stories so that indeed moments of apparent calm or happiness carry a residue of sadness, buttressing the script's central assertion that some changes aren't meant to be overcome but integrated. Getting part of the character's emotional armature, the followership is invited into this prolonged grieving process, encouraged to sit with discomfort rather than anticipate a quick return to equilibrium, and this tolerance distinguishes the plot from sensational tragedy. Why? By treating loss as a lived experience rather than a plot device, fostering a deeper emotional investment that extends beyond shock value. Thematically, the durability underscores the fragility of institutions erected on singular numbers, using Forrester Creations as a case study in how seductiveness and vision can both inspire greatness and produce reliance, and the death forces a collaborative reckoning with the troubles of deification, as characters defy the reality that no existent, no matter how brilliant, can truly embody an entire heritage without leaving chaos in their wake when they're gone. The script also explores the incongruity of permanence within a kidney known for reversals, subtly challenging the followership's prospects by averring that some losses cannot be undone without cheapening their meaning. And this asseveration lends the plot a gravitas that reverberates beyond individual scenes, shaping the tone of the show itself as it enters a new period defined by vulnerability rather than invincibility. As time passes within the narrative, grief evolves from acute pain into commodity quieter but further insidious, manifesting as vacillation, bitterness, or reckless jest. And the script precisely tracks these metamorphoses to show how undressed loss can distort judgment and connections long after gashes have dried, buttressing the idea that tragedy's true impact is measured not in sepulchres but in the slow accumulation of compromised choices. Eventually, this durability solidifies the death as a defining moment not because it dominates every plot overtly, but because it lingers invisibly, shaping provocations and fears in ways characters themselves may not completely fate. And by allowing Forrester Creations to stumble, acclimatize, and review itself in the shadow of absence, the script affirms that change born of loss is neither purely destructive nor redemptive, but profoundly mortal, leaving the company and its people suspended between what was and what might be, ever carrying the imprint of a life lost and a heritage fractured, yet still floundering, imperfectly and sorrowfully, to move forward in a world that will no way again feel whole. Transubstantiating what was formerly an acute extremity into a defining condition of life at Forrester Creations, where every triumph feels provisional and every failure feels amplified, because the characters are no longer operating within a stable emotional ecosystem but within a fragile, grief-shaped reality that distorts perception and magnifies consequence. And it's within this decelerate burn fate that the script finds its utmost unsettling power by illustrating how tragedy does and simply alter direction but alters meaning itself, reframing success, love, fidelity, and ambition through the lens of unrecoverable loss. As weeks turn into months, the absence left behind begins to take on a paradoxical presence, no longer raw enough to provoke open mourning yet too significant to fade into memory, performing in a pervasive emotional pressure that manifests as perversity, overcompensation, and denial, particularly among those who were closest to the departed and now struggle with the implied fear that their own individualities were too nearly intertwined with someone who's gone, leaving them doubtful of who they're without that gravitational center. This query feeds directly into the commercial heart of Forrester Creations, where leadership opinions are decreasingly driven by instability rather than vision, and where bold ideas are moreover aggressively pursued as evidence of independence or still buried out of fear that divagation from the history will invite review. Both approaches revealing different but inversely destructive responses to grief. The script adroitly uses these differing strategies to depict the cerebral fragmentation within the company, showing how characters who formerly participated a common thing now diverge sprucely in their doctrines, each induced that their way of recognizing the heritage is the only innocently defensible path, and this ideological conflict becomes far more sharp than any overt contest because it's fueled by sincerity rather than malignancy, making concession feel like treason. Simple with these commercial struggles are deeply particular reckonings, as characters begin to defy the emotional debts they owe to the departed and to one another, fating that death has firmed certain connections in a state of undetermined pressure, denying justifications, admissions, and remission, and leaving behind a residue of guilt that seeps into new relations, frequently surfacing at moments of vulnerability or closeness. When defenses are down and the weight of what was no way said becomes unsupportable, romantic connections, in particular, are tested by this emotional heritage, as mates carry grief else and at different pets, creating misalignments that breed misreading and resentment, and the script resists the temptation to resolve these pressures snappily, rather allowing them to erode trust gradationally, reflecting the reality that love does and always survive participated trauma complete, especially when each person's pain demands recognition and space. At the same time, the death functions as a moral reckoning, forcing characters to rethink once choices that were formerly justified by fidelity, ambition, or fear, and to defy the unsettling possibility that their conduct may have laterally contributed to the tragedy, a possibility that lingers like a quiet blameworthiness, shaping jest in subtle but profound ways, as some seek redemption through tone immolation, others through control, and still others through emotional pullout, each managing medium revealing further about character than any dramatic battle ever could. Generational dynamics grow decreasingly strained as youngish members of the Forrester route find themselves burdened with prospects that feel both illegal and necessary, pressured to step into places left vacant not just by death but by myth, and the script captures the cerebral risk of this heritage by depicting moments of vacillation, tone mistrustfulness, and reckless overconfidence, illustrating how the desire to prove oneself good of a heritage can be just as paralyzing as the fear of failing it. These youngish characters aren't simply inheriting power but inheriting undetermined trauma, a responsibility they didn't choose yet cannot escape, and their struggles come representational of a broader theme about the cost of heritage when it's passed down without medication or emotional check. Aged characters, meanwhile, grapple with a different kind of loss, not only the person who failed, but the vision of permanence that death has shattered, forcing them to defy their own vulnerability and dwindling influence in a world that's moving forward whether they're ready or not, and this battle frequently manifests as severity or despair, as they cleave to familiar scales and traditions in an attempt to assert applicability, inadvertently heightening the generational peak and buttressing the very insecurity they sweat. The script also explores how grief reshapes memory, allowing nostalgia to harden into tradition, as stories about the departed come decreasingly idealized, stripped of complexity and contradiction, and weaponized in debates about the future of the company, creating a sanitized interpretation of the history that serves present dockets while erasing inconvenient trueness. And this picky remembrance becomes a subtle form of deceitfulness that threatens to calcify Forrester Creations into a monument rather than a living institution. Creatively, the fashion house enters a liminal phase, caught between reverence and reinvention, where collections are scanned not just for aesthetic merit but for emotional authenticity, and contrivers struggle to articulate a voice that acknowledges loss without being consumed by it, a struggle imaged visually and thematically in designs that oscillate between stark minimalism and inordinate decoration, as if the company itself cannot decide whether to strip down emotion or drown in it. Critics and interposers smell this insecurity, and the external pressure intensifies the internal extremity, buttressing the feeling that the death has not only changed Forrester Creations from in but has altered how it's perceived by the world, turning every public appearance into a vote on whether the company still deserves its iconic status. Structurally, the narrative uses time as a quiet antagonist, allowing distance from the death to complicate rather than simplify its impact, as characters realize that grief does end observe direct progression but resurfaces unpredictably, frequently touched off by success, failure, or moments of joy that feel undeserved. And this cyclical depiction of mourning adds emotional literalism to the plot, reminding observers that mending isn't a destination but an ongoing concession with memory. The followership, too, is intertwined in this process, invited to reflect on their own attachment to the character who has failed and to the period they represented, creating a participated sense of loss that blurs the line between fabrication and emotional experience. And this meta-narrative dimension strengthens the plot's resonance by admitting that the true heritage of a character extends beyond the screen into the collaborative memory of observers, as new conflicts crop and old bones resurface. The death continues to serve as an unnoticeable fulcrum, still impacting provocations and opinions indeed when it isn't explicitly mentioned, and this narrative restraint underscores the script's commitment to treating tragedy with graveness rather than sensationalism, allowing its impact to be felt through consequence rather than constant memorial. Eventually, this durability affirms that the death wasn't intended to be a singular dramatic event but a structural metamorphosis, a reorientation of the show's emotional and thematic compass toward fragility, responsibility, and the uneasy concurrence of ambition and loss. And by allowing Forrester Creations to live in a state of ongoing recalibration rather than triumphant recovery, the script honors the weight of what has been lost while admitting the necessity of movement, indeed when that movement is painful and uncertain. In doing so, the story reinforces a central verity that defines its enduring appeal: that beauty